Peekaboo, I see you. They say children's television is harmless. They've never met Uncle Smiley at 2 a.m. in an empty house, holding a kitchen knife. The final pronouncement of the court fell upon my ears with the weight of a funeral bell. Though the learned judge spoke at length of irreconcilable differences and the welfare of the child, I confess that my faculties had already retreated into that dark sanctuary where the soul seeks refuge from unbearable truth. The gavel's sharp report marked not merely the dissolution of my marriage, but the severing of those tender bonds that had, until that moment, given meaning to my existence. My former wife's countenance bore an expression of profound relief, a look that cut deeper than any harsh word she might have spoken. But it was the sight of my dear Emily, my precious child, that delivered the final blow to my already wounded heart. She clung to her mother's skirts with desperate fingers, her eyes averted from mine as though I had become some loathsome creature unworthy of her regard. The house to which I returned seemed transformed, as though the very walls had absorbed the weight of my sorrow. Where once the cheerful disorder of childhood had reigned, toys scattered like fallen leaves, crayons abandoned in their colorful profusion, now only silence held dominion. It was then that I sought solace in that amber consolation which had become my too familiar companion, a bottle of whiskey that waited with patient malevolence beside my kitchen basin. I drank with the methodical desperation of a drowning man, until the world grew soft at its edges and the oppressive quiet seemed to press upon me like a living thing. It was in this state of diminished awareness that I first perceived the sound, a measured tapping, deliberate and rhythmic, as though some unseen visitor walked the corridors of my dwelling with the aid of a walking stick. Tap, tap, tap. I ceased my libations, straining every faculty toward the detection of this phantom percussion. Yet only the natural settling of timbre and the rushing of blood through my temples answered my scrutiny. Merely the spirits, I murmured to myself, though whether I spoke of the supernatural or the alcoholic variety, I could not say with certainty. It was at the precise moment when consciousness began its retreat toward oblivion that the electric apparatus in my parlor suddenly blazed to life. I started as though struck by lightning, my bleary eyes fixed upon the luminous screen that had, of its own volition, awakened from darkness. No hand of mine had touched the mechanism of control. Indeed, I had scarcely glanced at the accursed device all evening. Yet there it blazed in, full chromatic glory, filling my chamber with garish light and that particular melody which had once tormented my domestic tranquillity with its relentless cheer. Welcome, welcome, one and all, to Uncle Smiley's magical hall. A chill more penetrating than winter's breath displaced the whiskey's false warmth. This program, this detestable exhibition, had been the particular favorite of my lost Emily. How many times had I commanded her to silence its insipid chorus? And now, in the hollow aftermath of my domestic destruction, it dared to mock me with its presence. Upon the screen cavorted that grotesque master of ceremonies, Uncle Smiley himself, resplendent in his oversized cravat and wielding his polished ebony cane with theatrical flourish. The implement struck the floor in perfect rhythm. Tap, 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 while his companions, those fabric abominations he called his friends, performed their mindless dance. Bear and fox and rabbit they were named, though they bore no resemblance to God's honest creatures, being rather the fevered imaginings of some deranged seamstress. But lo! What transformation was this? The figure upon the screen ceased his capering and turned toward me with an intentionality that defied all reason. His painted smile seemed to widen beyond the boundaries of sanity itself. "Ah, what have we here?" spoke this apparition, though surely such communion was impossible. "A lonely father, drinking by himself. Tell us, dear friend, Where might little Emily be tonight? My throat constricted as though gripped by invisible hands. This was madness, pure and unalloyed madness. Yet the voice continued, honeyed with false sympathy. Could it be that the child no longer desires your company? How tragic! How perfectly, wonderfully tragic! The fabric creatures began their advance toward the camera, their button eyes gleaming with an intelligence no toy should possess. Their stitched mouths twisted into expressions of malevolent glee as they pressed against what I had believed to be the impermeable barrier between their world and mine. I lunged for the mechanism of control, stabbing at its buttons with frantic fingers. Nothing. I grasped the very cord that fed the device its vital force and tore it from the wall with desperate strength. Yet still the screen blazed with its unholy light, and still the voice of Uncle Smiley filled my chamber. You cannot silence us so easily, dear father. The entertainment has only just begun. What followed challenged the very foundations of reason itself. Before my horrified gaze, those creatures of cloth and stuffing began to emerge from their electronic prison, their forms rippling through the barrier as though it were nothing more than water. First came the bear, his round head squeezing through with a sound like tearing silk. The fox followed, sharp and quick as his namesake. Last came the rabbit, flopping into my reality with obscene familiarity. Terror gave wings to my feet, though the whiskey made them clumsy instruments indeed. I fled toward the kitchen, pursued by sounds that no Christian household should ever know, the scurrying of unnatural feet, the opening and closing of cupboards, the sinister rattle of cutlery being disturbed by unknown hands. When I dared to turn, there they stood, my daughter's beloved companions, transformed into instruments of my torment. In their fabric paws they bore the tools of domestic destruction, knife and hammer, and that pneumatic device I employed in my carpentry rendered suddenly terrible in those tiny appendages. "A game of hiding and seeking," cried the bear, brandishing steel that caught the light with murderous promise. "We excel at such diversions," squeaked the rabbit, testing the weight of his chosen weapon. "The rules are simple," whispered the fox, his device clicking with mechanical menace. "You run. We follow. Eventually, we find you." The hammer sang through the air, missing my skull by mere inches as I threw myself backward. Glass exploded around me as I crashed through the low table, its shards opening my flesh to paint the floor with crimson testimony to this impossible night. Through the corridors of my own home I fled, pursued by the sounds of systematic destruction. Behind me, nails buried themselves in plaster with rapid-fire precision, while the hammer sought out every framed memory of happier times. I gained my bedchamber and barricaded myself within, my breath coming in ragged gasps that seemed loud as thunder in the sudden quiet. But the quiet was illusion, for soon came that measured sound I now knew too well. Tap, tap, tap. Uncle Smiley's cane, drawing nearer with each deliberate strike upon my floor. I understood then, with the clarity that comes only in extremis, that this visitation had not begun with the television's awakening. He had been here all along, patient as death itself, waiting for the proper moment to reveal his presence. The door to my sanctuary began to splinter under renewed assault. Nails pierced the wood like angry hornets, one finding its mark in my flesh, sending fire through my limbs. I collapsed against the wall, my life's blood painting abstract patterns on the white plaster as consciousness wavered like a candle in the wind. And through it all, drawing ever closer, came that sound of measured approach. Tap, tap, tap. "The game concludes, dear father," came the voice, warm as honey, cold as the grave. "Time now to learn what it means to smile." In that final moment, as darkness gathered at the edges of my vision, I understood at last the true nature of my visitation. This was no supernatural manifestation, no ghostly retribution for past sins. This was something far more terrible, the precise and methodical accounting of a soul that had lost all claim to love, visited upon it by the very innocence it had failed to protect. The cane tapped once more against my threshold, and Uncle Smiley stepped into view, no longer confined to his electronic realm, but made flesh through the alchemy of guilt and whiskey and unbearable loss. "Welcome," he said, his painted smile stretching beyond all human possibility, "to the show that never ends."